Bob Fu has been with us before. He is also a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China. He is a former dissident inside China. He is these days a leading activist outside of it through the vehicle of specifically his non-governmental organization, China Aid. And we've asked him to talk a bit about what China's Communist Party is doing to wage war on people of faith. Bob Fu, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. Good afternoon. Really, the CCP and President Xi had launched a war on faith, which is part of his wars on civil society, actually, since he took power. For instance, his war against the rule of law, the human rights lawyers, hundreds were rounded up, and some end up in prison and still disappeared today. And the war on faith, actually, I need to elaborate that. It's not the war actually on all faiths. We have to understand that. He launched the war on those faiths that he deems not so compatible with socialism, or those adherents of those faiths who are deemed not totally controlled or obedient to the CCP's absolute control, such as, the faiths like the Protestant Christians, the Catholics, the Falun Gong practitioners, the Uyghur or Kazakhs Muslims, or a certain part of Buddhist, like a Tibetan Buddhist. These are the faiths that the CCP has been focusing on and targeting for persecution. So I want to emphasize on two fronts about the CCP's war on these faiths. By the way, if you notice the Chinese media, you can tell some faiths still are exempted from kind of this war or persecution. For instance, some part of Buddhism, some like Daoism in general, they were not only exempted from persecution, but because of their submissive or totally kind of obedient to the Communist Party's control, they were encouraged to grow. Actually, even some Communist Party officials would attend their official religious ceremonies. So the war was launched by two major fronts. There is a domestic front, there is an international front. The domestic front focused on three different areas. First, the CCP try to use the name of Sinicization, which literally means like to become Chinese. Like any faith has to be separated from any international kind of branches or your faith tradition. Then you have to become part of Chinese. So in essence, the Sinicization is like, fascification. It's like during the Nazi time. It's a nationalism, a communist version of their faith. So CCP basically, in all these major faiths that they're targeting, they call it doctrinal reconstruction. For instance, to the Protestant or Catholic faith, they would change from even 10 commandments to 9 commandments, because the first commandment is not compatible with President Xi's doctrine. And they are deeming a 5-year plan to try to retranslate the Bible, the scripture, in order to make so-called the doctrine compatible with socialism and communism. And in Tibet or in Xinjiang, they would not allow the Uyghur language of the Quran to be translated. Of course, any Uyghur or Kazakhs on their smartphone, if they find a version of Uyghur language of their Quran, is a crime and immediately sent to the concentration camp. So that's doctrinally. And then on the in terms of the religious size, since President Xi took power, thousands of churches, of course, Catholic Church and Protestant churches, and even Buddhist, some Tibetan Buddhist temples and mosques were either totally leveled, bombed, destroyed, or with their church, the crosses were forcefully burned, demolished, including 2 crosses just were forcefully demolished 4 days ago in a Catholic church, a big Catholic church in Henan province. So this is a part of the, of course, the structure for the religious size, and of course, every government sanctioned that is allowed to exist, these religious sites were mandated to on the pulpit or around the building to install massive, like surveillance face recognition cameras. And there is a massive data called National Religious Figure Data. By this month, May 22nd, the Communist Party even has a deadline. So every township, city has to submit like their local data in order to make this massive national data. I think that will be integrated into the overall so-called social score system. So that means if you are a Tibetan Buddhist, if you are a Christian, if you are Falun Gong, if you are in this system, then from your life will be forever ruined. Like from buying a train ticket to your passport, traveling to overseas. And of course, every arrested, these religious persecuted faithfuls are forced to basically to take their DNA and blood test. So this is part of the massive surveillance. And thirdly, from doctrinal to organization, the worship size control to organizational and personnel control. We just saw a document leaked that says the government is trying to use the Communist Party qualification, party member qualification, to filter the membership of the church pastors or bishops. So the kind of filters criterion would be to select a clergyman would be the equivalent of a party leader. So they have to be loyal and sworn the absolute allegiance to the party first before they can be ordained. And of course, there are thousands of church leaders and religious faithfuls were arrested, tortured. Last year alone, to the Protestant churches, over 50,000 Christians were being tortured and physically and emotionally. And I have our well-documented report, and I still have a few copies. If you want a copy, you're welcome to pick up. Really, I think that's the domestic front. I want to really shift to the international fronts. That's connected to ours. Okay, quickly. The international fronts, I would say the CCP used the 3 kind of approaches. First, the propaganda. Every year, the CCP, since 2008, has budgeted and spent $10 billion for overseas propaganda effort, according to BBC. And comparatively, the U.S. Public diplomacy budget is only merely $660 million every year. And of course, they also invite the selective kind of American church leaders, religious leaders, to go to China with red carpet, dine wine. I mean, I just name a few. Given the persecution, religious persecution has reached the worst since the Cultural Revolution, and those big influential American evangelical leaders that I know of, how many of them have chosen to speak up to even for their fellow brothers and sisters? I have great admiration for Franklin Graham, for his humanitarian work and gospel work. But because the CCP's, kind of enticement of his access to Chinese government, he is very much became trapped into that system. The penetration and the intimidation. So the penetration, of course, now from Maryland to Boston to really Sydney to other international, the free countries, all of a sudden you have red pastors. We call them coded red pastors, red churches. Those Protestant churches in North America, in Europe, would listen or obey the Communist Party's order than really the biblical kind of order. And if you don't do that, then your visa will be terminated. And if you travel to China, like currently there is a Chinese American pastor just arrested last week, and still held in Shanghai. And of course, they kind of use that way to threaten the American churches too. We just a very final story about this is really last year we invited during the prayer breakfast. I invited one of the China's finest Christian human rights lawyer, Dr. Li Beiguang, to the prayer breakfast. But 10 days later, after he left, he was declared dead in a Chinese military hospital at the age of 50. And we decided to have a memorial service in Washington, D.C., and we arranged with a big, most well-known church next to the Capitol Hill. I don't want to name the name. But after we just barely announced on social media, then overnight, China arrested all the missionaries in China, American missionaries, and interrogated them and told them, do you know what's going to happen in your church? So the church, unfortunately, because of that pressure, and immediately terminate the venue to host this memorial service, and we have to change the venue. It's close to the capital. So this is something I really want to raise the alert. I hope we can have a...
That's very helpful. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you.
Any questions for Bob Fu? Yes, sir.
Mike Donnelly, I'm a friend of Bob's. Bob, what's the connection between this and the security and the financial aspects that have been talked about here? And how would you see this fitting into that whole paradigm?
Yeah, I would say, this is really the Xi Jinping's global kind of ambition to exercise its grip, expansionism, control. So he's not satisfied only control the faith community inside the Chinese territory. He's using all the means, try to do the control, intimidation, penetration. And, internet, I think that's another issue, really influence our lives too. And I just, the Communist Party, of course, built this so-called internet, they call it Great Firewall. And that's the 21st century, really, the internet Berlin Wall. And I hope that, we in the free world can really focus on this area to build to encourage the development of internet circumvention softwares, that there are so many innovations already available. And yet, very sadly, our BBG, the only venue that has the capacity to do that, the Broadcast Board of Governors, was only they themselves set the limit that they would only spend 2.5% of the budget on internet circumvention kind of software or penetrating and to knock down the internet firewall. I think that is a very, very backward and dangerous kind of strategy. So I hope Congress can really pay attention, because the communist real fear is the truth, the information that the Chinese people would get hold of. So,
Thank you so much, Bob.